Welcome into another bonus episode here of Hockey Inside Out. With the trade deadline not too far away, we talk about the worst trades the Montreal Canadiens have ever pulled off of recent history here. So, Stu, in your mind, what was the worst trade you've seen from the Habs in the last 20, 30 years?
Well, rather than picking one specific one on this, I'm going to, with what's happening now with the Canadiens and Kent Hughes going into the trade deadline, I don't think he's going to make a trade just for the sake of making a trade. And I think one of the problems that Marc Bergevin had as a GM is he would make trades just for the sake of making trades at the deadline. And I go back to 2017. The Canadiens finished first in the Atlantic Division that season. They had 103 points. They had a really good team. And if you remember, they lost in the first round to the New York Rangers. At the trade deadline, Marc Bergevin went out and he got Andreas Martinson and Steve Ott and Dwight King. Those are the three guys he picked up. What he did is make his team older and a lot slower. And then they went into that playoff series, and Dwight King, nice guy, but he might be the worst player I've seen with the Canadiens in the last 10, 15 years. He just couldn't keep up anymore. And Bergevin kept talking about how he had won a Stanley Cup in LA and they needed to bring in a Stanley Cup experience. And what I think that did is throw that whole team out of whack. You know, you think that last game, I think it was game 6 in New York when they lost, and I'm walking through the press box and I see the healthy scratch. He's got Torrey Mitchell there. You had Nathan Beaulieu was a healthy scratch. I think Mike McCarron. And Torrey Mitchell had been really effective in that series on the fourth line. He was a fast player, speed, worked hard, and he was sitting out so that Dwight King could play. Dwight King played 6 playoff games that season. He had 0 goals, 0 points. Torrey Mitchell scored one of the highlight reel goals in that playoff series. But it was just a case of, you know, Marc Bergevin would never admit he made a mistake. And it was like, no, I got this guy and we're going to play him. And I think that really hurt that team in that series. I think it threw out the chemistry on the team. It made them slower instead of being faster. And then you go to 2021 when they did go to the Stanley Cup final, you know, at the trade deadline, you brought in Eric Gustafsson, John Merrill, and Eric Stahl. Again, making the team older, maybe slower. Gustafsson and Merrill hardly even played. They went with 4 defense in the playoffs, you know, and Sergachev sat. And other guys sat while they. So I think it's more of. I think the worst thing that the GM can do at a trade deadline is make a trade just for the sake of making a trade. And I think Marc Bergevin did that. And as I said, even though they went to the Stanley Cup final in 2021, you know, the Jesperi Kotkaniemi, one of the reasons he left is because he was made a healthy scratch so he could play the guys that they picked up at the trade deadline. Sergachev, who they had brought into the bubble the year before to gain experience and be around the team, he sat while they dressed Gustafsson and Merrill, who basically just sat at the end of the bench and didn't play. They tried to go through the whole playoffs with 4 defensemen. So I think it's just a case of those are stick out of my mind just as bad trades, series of trades, just because I think they were made just for the sake of making a trade.
Well, let's face it. There's a number of trades that probably didn't work out the way that they had hoped. But I'm going to go back a few years to 1990. Jyrki Lumme played with them. And he gets traded to Vancouver for a second rounder and went on to play 9 years there. And, you know, 4-time best defenseman. This guy was a good player. And I could never understand, you know, why he didn't fit in. But I do have an inside just before this played out on the trade where Pat Burns was the coach. We're in St. Louis and we're in the hotel bar having a beer. And Jyrki Lumme, and previous to the gathering, Pat Burns said, curfew, make sure you're in your room tonight. So we're sitting at the bar, and of course the curfew time came up, and I said, oh, curfew, I never miss a curfew, so I got to go, Jyrki. You better get to your room because Burnsy's going to check the rooms. And, you know, Jyrki, no, he won't check. We're in St. Louis. Nobody gets into trouble in St. Louis. I said, go to your room. No. Anyway, so I left. Next thing you know, in the morning, find out that Jyrki Lumme is on a plane to go back to the minors. Burnsy checked the room. He wasn't there. And the following day, he was traded to Vancouver. So, you know, what can we say other than things happen, and he was a good player, and you know, thankfully he was able to continue to play a few more years, but a good guy.
The most surprising part
of
that story,
all these years I've been wondering what was behind that deal. You know?
Well, the most surprising part about that story, Rick, is that you never missed a curfew.
I always used to say, check my
Go
room
ahead, Jack.
by 11 because after 11 I'm out.
Jack, your thoughts on the worst trade possible we've witnessed from the Montreal
You
Canadiens?
know, I think the worst thing you can do is what Stu brought up, that making a trade in order to make a trade. And Bergevin definitely did that. He did it in more than one trade deadline. And, you can look at the trades and say, well, he didn't give up a whole lot. But actually, I think what he did was he brought in players that undermined what he was trying to do. Mm-hmm. He actually actively made his NHL team worse. Never mind if it was only a second and a fifth or something that you were trading away. He really made his team worse. And that's the one thing I think you're never going to see with Kent Hughes. He's very patient. He's very smart. He's very thoughtful. I look at the trades. The guy's hardly had any time. He pulled off the Kirby Dach deal. He pulled off the Sherratt deal. And he pulled off the Matheson trade. And, if that's not a bad career for some GMs. And he's done that much in barely a year on the job. So, I don't expect any of these trades. For sure, the one thing you're not going to see is picks going for some worn-out ex that hasn't had a good season in 5 years,
Yeah, and it's the trades that he made, say 2021, they backfired on what his plan was. As they said, with Sergachev, they brought him into the Toronto bubble just so he'd have the experience, burnt the year of his contract so he'd have experience, be around the team. And then the next year they get Gustafsson and Merrill, and Sergachev doesn't play. And Kotkaniemi sits out. He gets so upset that he says, I'm out of here, and he takes the offer sheet from Carolina. So, they did get to the Stanley Cup final that year because of Carey Price, right? They would have lost to the Leafs in the first round if it wasn't for Carey Price standing on his head. But they didn't make sense, those trades, and it was just a case of making trades just to make a trade. Yeah.
Well, I'll throw in my 2 cents for this topic here. I did a Google search of deadline deals around that time. Vincent Damphousse, if you remember, was dealt to the San Jose Sharks, right? That first-round pick became who? Marcel Hossa. Not Marion, Marcel Hossa. And we know how Hossa was with the Habs. I'll give you one more, guys. Do you remember the name? And I know you guys will. Robert Dirk. Mm-hmm. If you remember, they brought him in, right, just around February, given around that time, to kind of fortify the back line. Reggie Uhl was really happy to have him on board. He lasted, 45 seconds, and his career was a wrap with the Montreal Canadiens. Yeah. So those are the 2 worst trades I've witnessed from the Habs in the last 30, 40 years of this franchise.
Well, a lot of the worst deals in hockey are made at trade deadline and on July 1st, right? The trade deadline deals and then the signings on July 1st. A lot of those things are made panic almost situation, or sometimes they're done just to do something. And more often than not, they seem to backfire.
And it's so rare that it really has a huge impact. I can remember one year, it seems to me, Marian Hossa was picked up by Detroit. And I thought, oh, man, that's it. Detroit's already a good team. He's not Marcel Hossa. He's going to put him over the top. And he didn't. And then he went over to Chicago, and he did succeed in Chicago. But that's a fairly rare case. I would have to trace it back here to see how often the needle has really been moved by a trade deadline pickup and a team trying to get better.
And a lot of times it screws up team chemistry too, Jack. As they go back to 2017, the Habs are the best team in their division. And, when they bring in these new guys, and then guys who have been there all year are sitting out, guys in the room who are friends with those guys, they're not happy. Like, how come he's sitting and this guy's coming in and playing? Yeah. We were fine without him. And I think that sort of goes through the room, and you lose. It has a negative impact, or I think it can have a negative impact in the locker room.
Well, if there's one thing to learn from this story of what we've regaled, St. Louis is one hell of a town to have fun. Don't forget to submit your questions and comments here on Hockey Inside Out. We look forward to conversing about that in a future episode. And check out the YouTube page for Hockey Inside Out for all the episode content as well. And sign up for the newsletter at MontrealGazette.com/newsletters and find for bonus content and full episodes. Hang on by Hockey Inside Out for all of that plus more. On behalf of Jack, Stu, and Rick, wish you a great week. We'll speak to you soon. Bye for now.